Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Antela, and I am honored to be your host tonight. A quick disclaimer that the information presented during this event is not medical advice, nor is it intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a physician or other qualified health provider with questions concerning a medical condition. And please never disregard professional medical advice or delay seeking it based on information presented during this event. Now, at this time, I would like to welcome our Executive Vice President of Programs and Services, Hector Garcia, for some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Kathy, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual forum number 33. Every time I do this and I look at how that number goes up, it's just incredible. And on behalf of the Immune Deficiency Foundation, it is my pleasure. And tonight, when we say, for number 33, it's a blessing to be joining you this evening. So. Thank you all for being here tonight. This past July, at your request, we hosted our first COVID-19 and Evolving Situation Forum, which we now call that one our first edition, because we're calling this one our second edition. And that forum was attended by over 240 individuals. Since then, IDF has continued to provide a number of forums based on the topics you continue to request. We are committed to keeping you updated. And so the time has come for us to offer you tonight the second edition as an update to COVID-19. As we all know, the situation not only continues to evolve, but this new normal will continue to be a different normal, as we move into the fall and into the holidays. To our return attendees, which are many of you, and I kind of just saw a few when I was, looking at the different faces, welcome back. It's always great to see you again. Some of you are very close to having attended all forums. For our new participants, welcome. It's always amazing to see how our forums continue to grow. We now have had over 3,500 participants since we pivoted to a virtual environment over 6 months ago. This is not only an incredible accomplishment for IDF and its, I'm going to say, admirable staff in serving you, but it just became a reality as you welcome us into your homes. I say this, with a big smile. We've gotten to know, you better. We've gotten to know our living rooms, our basements, sometimes our patios, depending if it's a Saturday morning or a weekday evening. Some of us gotten to know our children because they wave, they pass, through the screen and wave. In many instances, we have gotten to know our pets. I know my dog shows up whenever we're getting close to the end because she knows she'll get a treat. But most important, we gotten to know each other better. I think tonight our definition of family and community are similar. They're one and the same, knowing that we're not alone. As you can see from our mission on the next slide, IDF is dedicated to fostering a community empowered by education. We want you to remember that IDF is committed to serving you as a trusted resource through the use of technology and innovation, as you can see tonight, and through 33 virtual forums so far. We are here to give you the tools and information to become empowered. And we offer you our compassion as we value integrity and inclusion. We also want to offer you our full understanding and support, always emphasizing that you're not alone on your journey. We're all in this together every step of the way, and so far on a weekly basis to try to provide you with all the information you need to be able to advocate for yourself. It is also because our commitment that we will continue to provide you with forums in the months to come. And we now have a new event, which will be our National Summit on November 5th through November 8th. The IDF National Summit is a weekend-long virtual event designed to create time for people living with PI to get together with others who are experiencing similar situations. The summit will feature special keynote speakers, networking opportunities, educational sessions from physicians and healthcare professionals. Some of you might remember our summer regional conferences, which were postponed this year due to our unprecedented pandemic. So this upcoming summer, it's our response to actually be able to come to you, even if it's a little late in the year, keeping you safe by meeting virtually and keeping you informed no matter who you are or where you are. And one last thing I will say, the summit is it's at completely no cost to you. So there's no registration fee. This is an incredible opportunity for you to join your IDF family through a virtual environment. And now, let's get on with the show. I would like to thank our presenter, Dr. Blais, who I can call a good friend in a very short amount of time. Thank you, Dr. Blais, for taking the time out of your busy day to be here with us. It's because medical professionals like you who volunteer their time to IDF and to our community that we are fortunate enough to continue to provide these forums. We are also fortunate to offer these forums to our community because our incredible supportive sponsors. It is because their partnership and their contribution that IDF is able to bring you programs and services so that you're better informed. This includes our core service leaders, CSL Behring, Grifols and Takeda, our core services supporter, Octapharma, our core services sustainer, Horizon Therapeutics, our core services contributor, Lydian Biosciences and ADMA Biologics, our national sustainer, Accredo, national patrons, Diplomat Specialty Infusion, Kedrion Biopharma, CVS Specialty, Quorum CVS Specialty Infusion Services, Quorum Medical Systems, Cava Fusion, and Solio Health. And many of them, as you know, have plasma donation centers throughout the country. So we encourage you to visit their website for more information and see how you can help make a difference by donating plasma or getting others, to contribute to donating plasma. With that, I would like to pass it back to our host for this evening, Kathy Antilla. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. And at this time, I would like to now invite Margie Paring from CSL Behring to share a word from our sponsor.
Hi, sorry. I think I was on mute. This is Margie from Tampa, Florida, and I have Privigen, which is the IVIG. It's our 10% Privigen, and then I also have the subcutaneous version of Privigen, which is our 20% Hizentra. And Hizentra is #1 in the industry for subcutaneous primary immune. And I really look forward to meeting everybody in the breakouts. And I just want to say thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Hector, for allowing me to join you guys this evening.
Thank you, Margie. Now we would like to hear from Chuck Carruthers. Chuck, have you joined us yet? And if you have, we don't see your name, but please unmute yourself. We'd love to hear from you from Grifols. Debbie, I know you're here. Would you like to share a few words?
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie Manning. I am a nurse educator with Grifols, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to answering any questions you may have. And we're here to talk about Gaming XC as well as Zembify. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, now I would like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Michael Blaese. Dr. Blaise is a member of the IDF Physician Advisory Committee, and we are so very excited to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Blaise.
Thank you, Kathy. I want to thank the IDF for inviting me to come tonight and to talk with you about recent information about this COVID situation that we're all in. And before I start, I'd like to just acknowledge Dr. Mark Ballo, who presented the first of the COVID presentations. And I also have to thank Dr. Kate Sullivan from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who shared with me a great deal of unpublished information about what's going on with COVID and the PI populations around the world. And this is the first time I think you've had a chance to hear this, because as I say, it's unpublished. And she was kind enough to send me a manuscript, as well as she gave a presentation to the Clinical Immunology Society 6 weeks ago. And so she gave me some slides to use as well. So I really have to thank Dr. Kate Sullivan and acknowledge her contributions. You've all seen these kinds of maps. This is something that we got from the New York Times, and I would urge people to take advantage of the New York Times. They have an absolutely wonderful COVID department that's following many aspects of the COVID epidemic and pandemic. And if you need to find the latest information, the New York Times is great. As everybody remembers, this outbreak began in a nursing home on the West Coast. And almost immediately at the same time, we started seeing cases in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. And that blew up to be a very major source of infection. And I learned one thing today as I was reviewing literature. At the end of that blow up, if you look at every New Yorker who was alive at the time in February when this pandemic began, 1 out of every 360 is no longer with us. And if you consider my high school, that means a dozen people that I went to high school with are no longer around, or would have been had I been in New York. I think that's a staggering number to sort of think about, and it really drives it home. The reason I picked this slide is that it shows on the lower right-hand side the more recent progression. And as you know, it went from the mid-Atlantic north to the Northeast, then swept across the southern states. New Orleans had a big outbreak after I'm blocking on the name of Mardi Gras. And that brought together thousands of people from the outside in a close environment, a party environment, and they had a big outbreak of COVID following that. Then, as you can see, the red dots, which is the hot spots, have gone up the center parts of the United States, and now things like states like Wisconsin is very heavily involved with a lot of infection. But I don't know if you know what the state that has the highest incidence of COVID at the moment per capita, and that's North Dakota. And the second state that fits into that, the second highest incidence in the United States, is South Dakota. And then we see Missouri, Montana, and Utah in the top 10, even though there's almost no spots to show their involvement on this map. And that points out the difficulty. These are low population states, but if you look carefully at the map, you can see it's almost like a shotgun pattern of red spots that represent the outbreaks in the areas of higher population in the large towns and cities in these states that are now having outbreaks, where they thought previously that they weren't going to have any problem. This is one of the slides that Dr. Sullivan gave me, and it was just to review the immune response as we were thinking about what goes on with infection on the left-hand side. In the first week before the patients generally become symptomatic. And then, as you know, the symptoms are high fevers and coughs and other things, and we'll go into that in a minute. And during that first week, the defense system of the body is starting to generate and produce type 1 interferons. And that's very typical of viral infections, to generate an interferon response. And then starting at roughly 7 days out, you start seeing IgM antibodies to the COVID virus starting to develop. And then a week or so after that, the first IgG antibodies are developed. And the reason why IgG is important is that it can be a cytotoxic, a neutralizing antibody. The problem with IgM is, even if they're good antibodies, the molecule is so big it can't get out of the circulation, so it doesn't get to the sites of infection that are tissues. Now, if you look below that, you can see that T cells start responding by expanding their numbers in that first week, and it peaks somewhere along and then wanes a bit depending on the course of the disease. And on the very bottom of this slide, you can see something else, and that's listed as cytokines and chemokines. And for those of you that aren't familiar with those compounds, they're sort of like the messenger molecules where the cells of the immune system can talk to each other. And they have a whole variety of different functions. But as we'll learn later on in this talk, they're having a very important role in the outcome of a COVID infection. Okay, so what are the most common symptoms? You all know this, but we're going to go over it anyway. So fever, chills, sweating, cough, and shortness of breath are certainly the first signs that one should be concerned about and what happens to people to get an infection. The next group down is somewhat more severe in one sense, that is muscle and body aches, which you might think, and fatigue, which are also very important and profound when you read or listen to reports of people that actually have come through this. The muscle aches and the fatigue are really very difficult symptoms to deal with. Some people describe it as being run down by a truck. Congestion, runny nose, diarrhea, and vomiting are also common. One that we didn't expect was this new loss of taste or smell, which is a very important symbol. The last statistics I saw, somewhere between 35 and 40% of COVID patients suddenly realize that they can't taste anything and they don't smell anything. And having lost my sense of taste and smell with a different COVID infection a number of years ago, it's a terrible loss. You know, eating is boring as it can be because you can't taste anything. Another couple of things on that column are headache and confusion. And that starts raising the question, is there a problem beyond that that's important? Is this going to affect the central nervous system? We know that the development of pneumonia is very common. Kidney failure is another common outcome of the development of COVID infection. And then a variety of neurologic symptoms also come up, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, what else are we seeing in COVID-19 patients? asymptomatic carriers or people that spread the infection that don't know they're sick and don't know they have it was a surprise to all of us. And it turns out to be a major problem. And there's nothing like that amongst the other viral or pathogens. People get sick with the flu, they get sick with other disorders, but you have to sort of be sick before you start spreading it. That's not true with COVID, and that's why it's such a difficult disorder to trace and take care of, because people that don't have symptoms, you don't think of them as being ill, and yet they're spreading this bad disease. What we're recognizing now that all of the major organ systems can be damaged in this infection. So not only the lungs and the kidneys, but the liver and the heart and other organs. And they may happen individually, or you may have different organs failing in different patients. It can go from that individual situation with organs to a multi-organ system failure. And this is when everything shuts down. It's often associated with something called a cytokine storm. And I mentioned that earlier. You can think of it in a sort of simplistic way that these molecules are being produced by the immune system. And yet that thing that's causing the response isn't going away. And so they start making more and more molecules, more and more signals saying, you know, get going, guys, get rid of this thing. And eventually they're making so many cytokines that the body turns on itself. And now the immune system can attack all of the other systems, and it can cause a major problem that can result in death in a number of individuals. In addition to multi-system failure, now we recognize that we see psychosis and delirium as a consequence in a number of patients. Another unique feature of COVID infections is a blood clotting disorder that can result in blood clots going to the lungs, get strokes, heart attacks, and at post-mortem examination in people that have died from COVID, you find clots all over the body, in the muscles, as I said, in the kidneys, in the brain. And so that is another major problem. And blood thinning treatments, drugs to reduce clotting are now part of the standard therapy for COVID infection. Well, I mentioned sort of that the brain could be involved, but it turns out that there are some patients where only the brain has been involved. One striking case that I read about in the last week or so was a 19-year-old high school athlete who this summer was doing great. He was training, felt sort of crummy the night before, went to bed, and didn't wake up. And he had died of COVID. It was discovered at the autopsy that he had been infected. And the only place that he had inflammation was in the brain. So this is a case that died of COVID, but it was not a respiratory disease. It was a brain disease. And so that's something that we also have to be concerned about. And we talked about the psychosis and delirium. What we don't have any idea about is the long-term consequences of these kinds of involvements. So there's an acronym for this, for one thing that's been called the long haulers. And long haulers refers to the fact that recovery from acute COVID infection may not be the end of the story. And what we're finding is that the recovery period can be prolonged. It can be characterized by severe fatigue, by heart disease, by kidney failure, and again, neurological damage. So these patients now, what are we? We're 7 or 8 months out at the most from the beginning of this pandemic. We really have no idea how long this is going to go on and whether these people will ultimately recover, or will this be something they're going to have to live with for the rest of their lives? Well, here's another slide that I got from Dr. Sullivan. And on the left-hand side, you can see at the date of infection, again, the first week usually ends with the patient experiencing fever and shortness of breath and the other early symptoms we talked about. And the question is, what distinguishes the people that go through that period and then gradually get better, shown on the top, or those patients that end up in the hospital and ultimately can have a fatal outcome? And what Dr. Sullivan has been doing is studying not just the immune system, but actually the myeloid system. What's the myeloid system? It's the cells like monocytes and macrophages and granulocytes, the cells that we usually think about as being garbage scavengers that clean up after cells die and the rest of it. But these myeloid cells can also produce cytokines and chemokines. And what she's observed is that as cytokines go up in the body from that earlier slide, they tend to be the ones that are produced by the myeloid cells, not the ones that are produced by the lymphoid cells. And she's concluding that a lot of the major pathology that we're seeing with COVID disease is a result of the myeloid system being activated. Well, the CDC has got a slide that says, what can you do if you get sick? And I think it's important to know that the vast majority of people have mild illness and will be able to recover at home. If you think you've been exposed to COVID-19, contact your health provider and get a test if they're available to see whether you actually have acquired the infection or not. If you have, keep track of your symptoms. Take your temperature at least daily, and I would recommend keeping a log of your symptoms as a way of helping your healthcare providers assist you as you go along. And if you have an emergency warning signal that for instance, you're having trouble breathing, you should get emergency care immediately. This is another CDC slide that tells you what you can do to help manage your COVID symptoms at home. And, they say stay at home. If you must go out, wear a mask, but avoid using any kind of public transportation that you can spread the infection to the other passengers in using public transportation. I mentioned you should monitor your symptoms. Getting a lot of rest and staying hydrated is always important. If you have a medical appointment, I think this is very important from the position of your healthcare providers, is let them know you have COVID-19 before you go to the office so they can prepare so you don't infect people that are in the waiting room or the staff. Most docs now have a particular time that they will see people or a particular room that they take their patients to. So that's very important, I think, as we go along. For medical emergencies, use 911, but again, tell the dispatch person that you have COVID so that the responders can have appropriate protective gear. And cover your cough and sneezes with tissues or coughing into the inside of your elbow. Wash your hands for at least 20 seconds or use hand sanitizers. As much as possible, if you have COVID, stay in a specific room away from other people in your home. You should also use a separate bathroom if you can. And if you need to be around other people in or outside your home, wear a mask. So this is a serious quarantine situation. You don't want to infect the people that you love and that you're living with. Unfortunately, for so many people, doing these kinds of things is just not practical. And that's unfortunately the populations that are most likely to spread COVID and where we're having the highest death rates in the poor populations with that are underemployed. It's a really tough situation to follow some of these guidelines. Avoid sharing personal items with other people in your household, like dishes, and towels, and bedding. Try to protect them. And finally, clean all the surfaces that are touched frequently in your house with usual disinfectant sprays and wipes. These are all steps that are recommended, but obviously many people can't follow all of them. Well, we're raising the question about when do you seek, emergency assistance. And here's a list of things that I think, again, the CDC has recommended some of these. First of all, if you're having trouble breathing, it's the time to call the ambulance and get into a medical situation where you can be cared for. They list as another one, persistent pain or pressure in the chest as being a sign that something is going badly wrong and you should go get emergency medical attention now. If you're becoming confused, another sign that you should go and get an evaluation, at least in an emergency setting. If you're having an inability to wake up or to stay awake is another one of these emergency warning signs that people need to be aware of, that it could be serious. They also list bluish coloring of the lips or face or fingernail beds as an indication that you're not getting enough oxygen, that your lung disease is preventing oxygen to get in your system, and so your blood is losing its redness. And these are all particularly true if you're already in a high-risk group. So that was important that we knew just what are the signs that would tell you to get going and get more intensive care. Well, now we're talking about serious illness. Just what is the level of risk from COVID and immunodeficiency? And the CDC has a listing that says there are people that are definitely at risk, and then there are conditions that might be at risk. And on top list, you're familiar with many of those, is cancer, kidney disease, chronic COPD, solid organ transplants, obesity, sickle cell disease, type 2 diabetes, and severe heart conditions. In the might be category, you've got asthma, cerebral vascular disease, cystic fibrosis, high blood pressure, which I usually see in the, definitely at risk list, but it was sitting down here in the might be list. Bone marrow transplant recipients, people with dementia, liver disease, pregnancy, thalassemia, pulmonary fibrosis, diabetes type 1, and immune deficiencies. Now, why is it sitting there in might be? Well, it was because, if we have the next slide, I think we'll help answer that. The CDC classification was based on only 2 reported cases of COVID-19 and a primary immunodeficiency. There's another report that was sort of a summary, but there were only 2 kids with X-linked A gamma that were reported to get COVID pneumonia, and both of those kids survived and did well. Because there were so few patients being reported, an international collaboration was established, and this was done in 2 weeks by the IUIS, and the IUIS stands for the International Union of Immunology Societies. And so the immunologists around the world organized a collaborative study to try to determine what really is the incidence of COVID infection amongst our patients with primary immune deficiency. And that's why I asked this initial poll be taken of you about whether people have been quarantining themselves since the beginning. And I think more than 50% of the respondents said that's true. And that can account for why the incidence has been lower than we would anticipate amongst primary immune deficient patients. Well, this IUIS study has found, had 94 patients with inborn errors of immunity, or the abbreviation is IEI. And since there are now over 400 different definitive primary inborn errors of immunity, that's a lot of different diseases that could potentially fall under this rubric. It turns out that 56% of all of the respondents that were identified by these physicians around the world had antibody deficiency. And there was enough power to this particular study that they've been able to say that they don't think that antibody deficiency is at any higher risk for serious consequences than the general population. So in one sense, that's quite a comforting sign. And they've gone to the point of saying, you know, if your kid has got agammaglobulinemia or CVID and school is opening, that your child should probably be sent to school, because the incidence of infection and serious infection in school-age kids is pretty low, and you can go there because you're not going to get sicker than the average person in your age group. Well, there were 9 COVID-associated deaths in that group of 94 patients. 7 were adults and 2 were children. And interestingly enough, all the deaths were in patients with some pre-existing condition. And it's not really very clear whether they died because they had a serious problem with their underlying condition. For instance, there were a couple of kids with CGD that had serious bacterial infections who then happened to get COVID. And it would be very hard to say whether they died because of the COVID or because they had a serious underlying infection. And that was true for most of them. So it's hard to use that 9 out of 94 as being an indication about the severity of the patients with primary immune deficiency. But at least it's not screamingly high, which is what we were concerned about. As I said, all of the deaths were in patients that had some pre-existing conditions. And there's a line in there that I didn't understand exactly what they were getting at, but it's had risk factors for severe disease and death in the general population were also affecting those with inborn errors of immunity. But it concluded with including more younger patients, and I wasn't sure exactly what that meant, but that's what they reported. Well, obviously, we've all been waiting for a vaccine, but the vaccine development is not something that doesn't have issues that we have to deal with. First of all, will the public trust a vaccine given this highly politicized environment relating to its development, and will they take it? There's a question of efficacy. What we've done generally in developing new pharmaceuticals, for instance, is you try to get a group of people that are healthy and you want to give them the drug or whatever it is and see how they did. But that we know that with this disease, there are very specific populations that are of much higher risk, like the elderly or African Americans or Hispanics and Native Americans. And so once you start including people that have significant risk factors already, it makes the problem for the people that are doing these clinical trials is you've got to expect that some of these severe complications that they may already have are going to cause problems in evaluating exactly how effective the vaccine is or how dangerous it is, because people may have problems with their underlying conditions. So short-term safety is difficult, and certainly we're all interested in side effects of long-term, and that has to be addressed before people are going to take this. The question is, how long will it protect? You know, we believe that many people that become immune to COVID lose that immunity in just a few months. So if you're taking a vaccine that's going to poop out in 4 months, is it worth the effort or the expense or the risk associated with it? Other questions are, you know, how many shots you're going to have to take. If you make 1 million doses of vaccine, but you have to give 2 doses, that means that you'll only have half as many patients that you can treat as you have doses of vaccine. So that's an important issue. And if you need to give a booster shot, say at 6 weeks, that makes it even more difficult. Something that I hadn't realized, but some of these developing vaccines have very unique shipping and storage problems. Turns out that the 2 most advanced vaccines along the pipeline going through the testing have to be shipped and stored at less than 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, there aren't a whole lot of places that are equipped to handle that situation. And so distribution throughout the country, you're certainly not going to be able to put that in your doctor's office. He's not going to have a way of keeping it. Now, it's basically liquid nitrogen shipping, but that really does raise significant complications compared with a vaccine that can be stored at room temperature, which we'd love to have, or a pill, but it's something we have to consider. It's going to be a complicating issue. And finally, can enough be made? I sort of addressed that. Most of the pharmaceutical companies feel that they're going to be able to make millions. A couple of them think they can make 1 billion doses in the next year. We'll have to see. And the basis of all of this vaccine stuff is that herd immunity is going to develop. And so that you want to develop this enough immune people that will protect those who can't take the vaccine, as an example. We just don't know. And if you can't get people to take the vaccine, then you might not be able to reach that level of herd immunity. Well, it's titled Vaccines in SARS-CoV-2. What in the world is SARS-CoV-2? Well, SARS was serious acute respiratory syndrome, and it was a coronavirus that appeared, a few years ago. I can't remember exactly, but it was probably in the last decade or so. Well, that was the original SARS. It turns out that COVID, the virus that causes COVID, is very similar to the initial SARS virus. So it's called SARS-CoV coronavirus 2. So you'll see that, and in medical literature, if you're trying to describe the virus, you talk about SARS-CoV-2. If you're talking about the illness, it's called COVID-19 or coronavirus infection 2019. Well, we all heard how long it takes to generate vaccines, and people are really racing forward. And to have a vaccine even in the next year, we're still talking about 12 to 15 months to develop a vaccine, which is sort of unheard of. Researchers are currently testing 43 vaccines, different vaccines in clinical trials on human beings. And there are at least 91 preclinical vaccines under active investigation in animals. So we're talking about 130 plus potential vaccines that are being worked on at the moment. Now, the idea behind most of the vaccines is to make an antibody that will neutralize the virus. In this picture, the red things that are sticking out from the side of the virus are called spike proteins. And it turns out that if you can block a spike protein with an antibody coating, as an example, you can prevent infection. The the virus needs to get the spike protein onto cells that have the appropriate cell surface receptor, and the antibody will block it. And neutralizing antibodies may have enough strength to just kill the virus all by themselves. So what we're going to look at is, you've all heard about, this testing ladder, but it's important to know in preclinical testings where the vaccine is given to animals such as mice or monkeys to see if it produces an immune response. And that's where there were 91 trials, if I remember, that are going through at that stage. So all of the vaccines that are in clinical testing have at least shown in animals that it can produce an immune response to the virus. Phase 1 is a safety trial where you give the vaccine to a limited number of patients, maybe a couple dozen or so, to make sure that the vaccine is relatively safe. And if you add a few more patients, you can do a dosage study as well to see what dose of the vaccine would give you the best responses. You go to phase 2, which is basically an expanded trial for safety, but now you're splitting it into different groups of people. This is, for instance, children or the elderly or different ethnic groups that are at high risk. And the trials will tell you whether it works. If you have a vaccine that only works in children, or only works in Caucasians, or whatever it is, it will limit its usefulness as a general vaccine. If the trials go through and succeed in phase 2, then they go to the phase 3 stage, that is an efficacy trial, when the vaccine is given now to hundreds of people and maybe thousands of people. And you wait to see how many become infected. And then you compare the people that got the vaccine with the people that got placebo. And these trials can tell if the vaccine protects against coronavirus. There's a question, though, that I have and others have. Just how effective does it have to be? If you ask me, I'd like to have a vaccine that protects at least 90% of the population that get it. What if it's only 50%? So if you get the vaccine and still 50% of the people that get it can get serious COVID infection, is that worth it? Well, in fact, the FDA has set the limit for when they will make something approved for authorization to use is at 50% efficacy. So that's disappointing. Hopefully, as the vaccines continue to come along, we will see that that number will go up. It's a little disappointing to think that you could have a vaccine that's going to be approved and it only protects half the people that get it. Well, this is something from the New York Times. They have a vaccine tracker that they update every week or so. And they have gone through the different phases. There are 29 vaccines that are now in phase 1, 14 in phase 2, 11 vaccines in this large scale efficacy testing phase. There are 5 vaccines that have been approved for limited use, but none that have been approved for full authorization. Now we have to talk about the limited group. It turns out that the Russians and the Chinese have decided to dispense with phase 3. So they've started use of their vaccines, 5 of their vaccines, in patients only having gone through phase 2. They got a huge negative reaction when this was announced. You might know that Vladimir Putin has labeled their leading vaccine as Sputnik 4, as a direct saying that they're getting in there first. Well, they're getting in there first with a vaccine that has not been appropriately tested. And they've gotten so much heat that both the Chinese and the Russians have said they're backing off and they're starting to do real phase 3 trials. But it turns out also that all of their military is getting the phase 2 vaccine, sort of a captive audience. Well, what types of vaccines are there being made? And it turns out there are 5 groups. There are genetic vaccines. Those are vaccines that deliver a coronavirus gene directly into our cells to promote an immune response. And the 2 leading vaccines out there are messenger RNA vaccines. Those are the ones that have the storage problem. But there are 2 in phase 3 trials in the United States. One of those trials has enrolled 30,000 patients. There are also 3 DNA vaccines that are at phase 2. Then we have viral vector vaccines. And those are vaccines that take another virus that's been engineered so it doesn't cause disease and sticking in genetic information from the coronavirus so that you can infect it in, but it doesn't cause disease, but it does vaccinate. And just as a point of reference, that's exactly the same strategy that was used for a lot of gene therapies, where you take a virus, modify it, put in the gene, the therapeutic gene of interest, and infect it into the cells. Now, for this particular vaccine use, there are adenovirus type 5, a mixture of both adeno5 and adeno26. A US company is using adeno26 alone, and they are enrolling 60,000 patients in their phase 3 trial. Not a trivial undertaking. The trial that you know that came from Oxford University that was paused because of a serious adverse event that occurred is using a chimpanzee adenovirus. And other vaccines that are being tested at the preclinical stage use vesicular stomatitis virus or even a weakened measles virus. And I've always wondered, if everybody's immune to measles, how can you ever get that in to infect anybody? But we'll see. It's coming from the Pasteur Institute and they know what they're doing. So hopefully it'll work out okay. The third group is a protein-based vaccine, and most people are familiar with that. That's like tetanus vaccine is a protein, the tetanus toxoid. Diphtheria vaccine is another one. So many of the vaccines that we've known in the past are this protein-based vaccine. There's one of those vaccines at phase 3. There are several in phase 1, 2, or 2. And they're testing a variety of things in addition to the protein, but how do you deliver it? Can you jazz it up by an adjuvant that makes it a more effective vaccine, or put it on particles? There are actually a lot of different approaches that are being used in that group. The fourth group is a killed or weakened virus vaccine. And we're all familiar with that strategy, for instance, from polio, where there would be a weakened vaccine that can't cause the disease, but can generate an immune response. And many of the vaccines that were used before that were killed virus vaccines. I think the Sabin vaccine for polio was a killed vaccine. And the last group there is called repurposed vaccines. And that's taking a vaccine that was built for something else and trying it in COVID. And the one that's getting the most activity is a tuberculosis vaccine called BCG, which is widely used in Europe. It hasn't been used in the United States very much, but they're giving BCG to see if it will have an effect. And there were cancer vaccines that were developed using BCG. It's a very potent agent that stirs up the immune system and can work to make things work better. So I presume that's the way. I really haven't been able to find the papers that describe that type. So that's what we're working with. But looking forward, what's coming down the road? Colder weather. And colder weather means life moves indoors. And we all know the the recommendations to not go indoors with large groups of people. You're better if you stay away from restaurants and bars and whatever it is. And now we're going to have to be indoors because of the weather. So that raises a significant question about the future months. In addition to COVID-19, we're also going to see seasonal influenza. So now we have double trouble. These are similar, the symptoms that occur with both COVID and seasonal flu are very similar. So if you get sick, you're not going to have that distinguishing feature because they're both going to be circulating in the community at the same time. And you won't necessarily know if you get a respiratory illness, whether it's COVID or flu. So it's going to be important that we have vaccine, tests out there. There is a good test for influenza that can be given in the doctor's office. We don't have a similar test available for COVID. So that's an issue that we're going to be facing as we get into this flu season. So what can you do to protect yourself and your family? Well, there's self-quarantine. And we just learned already that 50% of our patient population is quarantining and have been since this pandemic began. If you can't quarantine, try to follow the social distance, wear masks, hand washing, sanitation of your home as much as you can, because those things will help you against both influenza and COVID. But with flu, we have another thing, and that's the influenza vaccine. And I've been writing the flu recommendations for IDF for a number of years, and one of the things I always push is that what we would like to do is develop a protective cocoon around our immune deficient patient. And so if everybody in the household gets a flu vaccine, that's one way of developing that cocoon so that he will be protected from at least people that live in his household from bringing back influenza. But there's an even better way now and a new application. You've all heard about Tamiflu, which is an anti-influenza drug. And the problem with Tamiflu is that you have to give it in the first 48 hours of infection. Well, most people really don't realize that they got something until late on the second day, and then it's too late to get the drug, and it doesn't work well at all if you start it later. But the CDC is now recommending, and this is a new recommendation that's going to be controversial, but they are recommending that everybody at high risk take Tamiflu prophylactically, beginning at the start of the season, all throughout the entire flu season. So that means taking one pill of Tamiflu. It's now got a generic, so it's potentially cheaper. I haven't heard a response from the insurance companies yet, but I know that my particular Blue Cross Blue Shield allowed prophylactic use of Tamiflu last year, because my wife and I both took it for 3 weeks when we were traveling to see our grandchildren. So I hope that everybody will check and see if that's available, because it would be a wonderful way of protecting our primary immune deficient patients, because they're not going to respond to the vaccine. And another issue that's important that also the CDC has been thinking about, people are stressed out like crazy from this quarantine, all of the restrictions that we're having to follow because of the pandemic. And so stress has become a major problem. The CDC has prepared a publication called COVID-19 Parental Resource Kit that actually breaks down children as being preschool, elementary school, middle school and high school, and then college-age young adults, with recommendations. How do you deal with stress in the home and with people of these ages? And I would encourage folks to go to the CDC website and take a look at this, because I think it would be useful and something we don't think about. Another thing I would just recommend is don't be embarrassed to go get professional help if there's an enormous amount of stress that's making your life go crazy. You know, there's a lot of professionals out there that can help you, and please give it consideration. Well, looking forward to the coming season. The success of the entire vaccine program depends on its ability to provide population-wide protection from COVID-19 infection. Otherwise, we're going to have to accept some level of continued risk or find something else to keep us safe. Primary immunes may not respond effectively to any vaccine, so even if we have one, they're not going to be protected. So we're going to have to develop new preventatives or new treatments. Well, there are a lot of strategies that are going on, but the main ones are here. And one is that there are antiviral drugs, either new compounds that are in development or repurposed existing drugs. The major one that's being used now against COVID-19 disease was actually first developed to treat the original SARS infection. And there's enough cross-reactivity between SARS and the virus that causes COVID-19 that drug is now found a place in therapy of COVID-19. T-cell therapies are also being developed. You're familiar with cancer therapies using recombinant what's called a CAR T-cell or a chimeric antigen receptor modified T-cell. So they actually take a T-cell and give it a new direction. It changes its antigen receptors so they can attack cancer. And now that approach is being used to identify COVID-infected cells and to kill them. Gene therapy is being used or is being developed as an idea for treatment or prevention for COVID disease. But it's the last two that I am most encouraged about. One is convalescent plasma, and I believe that the plasma protein producers of a consortium working to develop convalescent plasma as a readily available product so that you can give people that need protection, prophylaxis, plasma that's been recovered from people that have recovered from COVID-19. Another similar approach is human monoclonal antibodies. In this case, you'll take B cells from patients, identify B cells that are making particularly potent antibodies against COVID-19, and then they grow them up in a clone to produce large quantities of these protective antibodies. And, you know, to me, this is an incredibly important area because it's one that can be applied to a large patient or normal population. It's ideal for anyone who may be exposed to potentially infected people. So certainly PI patients with antibody deficiency who are not going to respond to a vaccine, this would be great to just substitute their monthly injections with regular IgG to using one of these convalescent plasmas or monoclonal antibodies. With the monoclonals, they're not going to have the other specificities, but they could be given independent of regular immunoglobulin replacement. But you can think about protection for first responders until we have a vaccine that works for them, medical staff, teachers and school staff. You know, even if the kids are not at risk, my son-in-law is a school teacher. And he was just put in quarantine because one of his kids had COVID-19. He's got type 2 diabetes, so he's got a high risk group. And, you know, it's scary. And yet his school district makes him go and take care of special ed kids. And So if we could give him a prophylactic antibody that would protect him, it'd be wonderful. You know, there's long-term care facilities that are highly hit. Prisons are being clobbered. You know, food processing plants, the list goes on, where this sort of protective materials could be really terrific. And I encourage our plasma protein people to keep working on this idea, because it's really very important for us. Well, stay safe. Wear your mask, practice social distancing, avoid indoor groups, wash your hands, be prepared for both COVID and influenza, self-quarantine if you can, and I'm just so happy to get that information from our little brief survey, because I think it's telling us why PI patients are not getting terribly sick with this. And finally, check back with IDF for the latest news. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blais. And as a reminder to everybody, please submit your questions into the chat box and send them to IDF Forums. And at this, then Dr. Blais will answer as many as possible. And right now, before we continue, I would like to hand it over to Carl Trenz from Octapharma for a word from our sponsor.
Kathy, thank you, and good evening to the IDF community. I first would like to thank Dr. Blais for a thorough presentation, but I think more importantly, putting a face on the patients who are most at risk, and also let us remember those that we've lost. It's been quite a sad time. You know, we at Octapharma have continued since the outbreak of COVID to take the work of our research and our scientists, and really all as an industry are doing this. But if you'd like to learn more about what Octapharma is doing to make a difference around COVID-19, you can go to a website that was developed to inform you. That is covid19.octapharmausa.com. And in there, you'll learn more about, once again, what Octapharma is doing, but more importantly, the work that we're doing to address those patients who are in severe situations in the hospital, dealing with the cytokine storm that Dr. Blais had mentioned. So please take an opportunity to look at that if you have. And then we'd also encourage you to join us in the breakout rooms. This evening, one of my wonderful colleagues, Joanna Maltese, a clinical nurse educator, will walk you through more about Octapharma's support program called IG Cares. So once again, thank you for the time this evening. Have a good rest of your evening, and I'll now turn it back to my good friend, Kathy Antilla at IDF. Kathy?
Thank you, Carl. Now, before we continue, I would like to invite Kevin Ahern from Soleo Health for a quick word from our sponsor.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Blais, for the presentation. I'm having a problem with my camera, so I apologize for that, but I work for Soleo Health. We're a national provider of complex specialty pharmacy and infusion services. We offer IG infusions in the home or one of our ambulatory infusion suites. We do both IVIG and subcutaneous IG. It's a pleasure to sponsor this IDF Educational Forum. We hope you all benefit from the information. We wish we could be there in person, but look forward to seeing you next year. Stay well.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing from all of our sponsors during our virtual exhibit hall after the Q&A. So right now, thank you everybody for submitting so many wonderful questions. And thank you, Dr. Blais. We are going to start asking you some of these questions. Can you talk about why everyone always suggests to get the flu shot for people with PI when we struggle to make antibodies to other vaccines? Same will probably go with the COVID vaccine. So what is the thinking behind that?
Well, I agree with that concern. And in fact, my press is always get the family. I talk about this protective cocoon, which I think is critical for the health of our patients. it does turn out that some of our patients with antibody deficiency can make antibodies to something. And I guess that must be the reason why a vaccination has been recommended. But also, as part of the question, chances are that most of them are not going to respond. Now, that's in the sense of antibodies. There is the possibility that T-cell immunity may be preserved in an antibody-deficient patient. Many of them are. And we know, for instance, with COVID, there's been a very interesting study with the COVID virus where they've tested the ability of T-cells to kill COVID-19. And they find that a lot of them do. Not normal people. And depending on the study, sometimes it was 5% of the population, sometimes as many as 40% of the tested population had T cells that could kill COVID-infected cells. Well, why is that? Well, it turns out that regular cold virus, that's COVID, has a peptide protein sequence on its surface that apparently immunizes T cells. They responded to the cold virus, but the response that they make to that cold virus can turn out and kill or inhibit a COVID-infected cell. So I think the real reason is, the hope is that cellular T-cell immunity would be activated by the vaccine.
Next question, should all PI patients get the coronavirus vaccine when it is available, or are there certain groups of PI patients who should not get the vaccine?
Well, I think that depends on the individual characteristics of the vaccine that finally makes it out. There are some that are more likely to be able to generate, for instance, T-cell immunity, which may be helpful. Some that are less likely to be able to do that. So if you have profound antibody deficiency, like an XLA as an example, I'm not so sure that, for making antibody, that's going to be a protective strategy, but it's, again, possible that they will be able to make a T-cell response. So I really want to know which vaccines make it, what their level of activity is. Again, if they're only going to affect and help 50% of the normal population, I would think that their success rate in a PI population is going to be even less. And whether that's going to be worth it or not, we'll just have to see.
Next question is the recommendation to take the prophylactic Tamiflu during the flu season from the CDC. And also, do you think our immunologists are aware of this recommendation?
It's a new recommendation as far as I can tell. I hadn't seen it before, and I think it's a game changer recommendation. I heartily support it if you can get it paid for. And that's really going to be the bottom line. And I don't know how many of my fellow immunologists have heard about it. I didn't know about it until I read, the CDC website from one end to the other to get more information. And I've been waiting for that to come out. As I said, I have used it prophylactically for a period of 3 weeks, but this season-long thing is clearly a new recommendation.
Now we have a couple more minutes for questions. I'm going to ask one or two more, and then we're going to follow up with people who have submitted their questions with their name into the chat box tonight. We'll follow up via email. So the next question is, should all patients with PI get the flu shot every year?
Well, it's the same question, I think, we've already tried to go over. I would just say that it's a hard one to answer in the sense that the flu vaccines have been very variable in their efficacy. And a couple of years ago, only 30% of the people that got the flu shot actually got protected. Other times the vaccines are better, but the flu vaccine by itself has been notoriously weak.
What are your recommendations for the holiday season in order to get together with family or not?
I think it's a very tough one. If I were in a position of, I've been in self-quarantine because of my age since March. And, you know, one of my daughters was going to get married. We actually put the wedding off for a year. And I think it's a difficult thing to recommend. It depends on your family. I mean, if you can have family who's willing to go into quarantine for, you know, 10 days, 2 weeks before they come to you, and you know they're negative, or they take a COVID test to show that they're negative before they come. But, you know, it's got to be right before they come, so you know that they haven't picked up something in the situation and time in between. But I appreciate the severity and the seriousness of the question, and I wish I had a better answer. But I think if you've been in protection for all these months, self-quarantine, it's tough after putting up with all of this for this long to take a risk. And because we think that the COVID infection rate is already up, the arrow is up in 40 out of 50 states right now, and it's only going to get worse. So given that, I would say it's risky.
Thank you. Last question. Although PI patients may not be more likely to die from COVID-19, are we more likely to contract COVID-19 than normal people?
There's no data on that. I wish we had it. I mean, one of the reasons I was delighted that we got the responses we got from the poll at the beginning was it told us that our population of patients is taking this seriously, and they're doing the only thing they really can to protect themselves, and that is to self-quarantine. And I don't have a better.
Thank you, Dr. Blais. We will be following up with you and sending over the questions that we weren't able to answer tonight. So everybody just make sure that your name is included with your question, and we will follow up within the upcoming week or so. And right now, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Blais. Thank you, everybody, for sending in these wonderful, wonderful questions. And at this time, I would like to invite Sean McCabe from Takeda for a quick word from our sponsor.
Thank you, Kathy. Can you hear me? Just getting
yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Blais, sincere thanks for not only a thorough, as mentioned before, a very thorough presentation, but obviously your commitment to the community and serving very, very apropos, relevant information. You, like so many others, are a hero in the moment. And as stated from the peer at Octapharma, I believe Carl, I didn't catch the name, but certainly thoughts with so many in the moment. It was very, very well said. From an industry standpoint, Takeda, we're the proud manufacturers of IG therapies as well. GammaGuard, HyQvia, Cuvitru, if you know the name. But we're not here tonight to talk about our products. We're here to talk about our community services. And so to that end, I'm joined by my colleagues, Dana Flathammer, along with Shauna. I believe I saw in Austin, also joining from our community support team. So we'll be in the breakouts to address any questions you may have and offer a little bit of a preview to our services. And just also very special thanks on this, I think what was the number 33 or more moments in which the IDF has connected with the community in such a profound way in the moment, serving relevant information, staying connected. And most importantly, I saw based on yet another night of pretty significant participation, this empowered community. We're here with you, we're here to serve, and let us know how we could be better assist throughout. So my thanks, and we'll see you later.
Thank you, Sean. Now, finally, before we head into the virtual exhibit hall, I would like to encourage you to please connect with IDF online, visit our website, and access the many resources IDF has to offer, such as publications, online support groups, updates on upcoming events, and so much more. And you can also connect with IDF on social media to keep up to date with our community. So once again, thank you to all of our sponsors for today's forum. And right now, I would like to say, in addition to our wonderful forums, which you've experienced tonight, we are so very, very excited about the IDF National Summit, which is coming up on November 5th through 8th. There will be programming for all ages. So please stay in touch, because we have information that will be coming out this week about that wonderful summit. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Please take care and be safe. Bye.